The farmer's market in Briarwood, Missouri was a Saturday tradition. Wooden stalls lined the cobbled street, overflowing with fresh produce, homemade jams, and bouquets of wildflowers wrapped in brown paper. Laughter and conversation filled the air as neighbors caught up on the week's news. For 6-year-old Annie Mitchell, the market was a world of wonder. She walked hand in hand with her grandmother, Margaret, whose silver hair was pinned neatly as always. Annie loved these mornings, the scents, the colors, the stories her grandmother told about kindness and second chances. But this morning, something made her stop. "Grandma, look." Near a vegetable stall, tied to a rusted post, was a large, ragged dog. His fur was dull and tangled, his ribs faintly visible beneath his coat. He lay motionless, his brown eyes tired and distant, as if he had given up on the world. Margaret followed Annie's gaze and let out a quiet sigh. She had seen that look before, the look of a creature who had been forgotten. Annie stepped closer, her voice soft. "Hi there, boy." The dog flicked an ear but did not move. Margaret put a protective hand on her granddaughter's shoulder. "Careful, sweetheart. Some dogs don't take kindly to strangers." But Annie wasn't afraid. She had always understood animals in a way that most people didn't. Nearby, the stall owner, a gruff man named Frank Dawson, glanced at them. "You looking at that mutt?" he muttered. "Is he yours?" Annie asked. Frank shrugged. "Suppose so. Ain't worth much. Can't hunt, can't herd. Just taking up space." Annie's small fists clenched. She felt things deeply, and the idea that someone could talk about a dog that way made her heart ache. "Does he have a name?" Frank snorted. "Never bothered naming him. Not like anyone calls for him." Annie turned back to the dog, crouching down a little closer. "You don't have a name?" she whispered. For the first time, the dog moved. His dull eyes met hers, and though his tail did not wag, there was something, a flicker of recognition, a tiny spark of hope buried beneath the sadness. Margaret saw it too. And in that moment, she understood. This wasn't just another stray. This was a soul waiting to be seen. The next Saturday, Annie and her grandmother returned to the farmer's market. The morning sun was warm, casting long shadows across the cobbled streets, and the air smelled of fresh bread and ripe peaches. But Annie wasn't interested in the vendors or the friendly greetings from townsfolk. Her eyes were searching for him. And there he was. The dog lay in the same spot as last week, chained to the rusted metal post near Frank Dawson's vegetable stall. His fur looked even dirtier now, his ribs more visible beneath his tangled coat. His head rested on his paws, his brown eyes staring blankly at the dust-covered ground. Annie's heart clenched. "Grandma, can I go see him?" she asked softly. Margaret, who had been watching the dog too, sighed. She knew that look in Annie's eyes, a kind of quiet determination that didn't fade easily. "Stay where I can see you," she said. Annie hurried forward, crouching just a few feet from the dog. She spoke in a voice so soft it could barely be heard over the market noise. "Hi again," she whispered. The dog didn't move. She reached out her small hand, palm up, just as her grandmother had taught her when meeting new dogs. "It's okay," she murmured. "I won't hurt you." The dog's nose twitched slightly, picking up her scent. His ears flickered, just a small motion, barely noticeable, but it was something. From behind his stall, Frank Dawson let out a gruff chuckle. "You again?" he muttered. "Still worried about that mutt?" Annie turned to him. "Why won't anybody take him home?" Frank wiped his hands on his apron, uninterested in the conversation. "'Cause he's no good. Won't fetch, won't guard, won't listen. A waste of food if you ask me. Annie felt anger rise in her small chest. How could someone talk about a dog like that? But, doesn't he deserve a chance? She asked, her voice firm despite the lump in her throat. Frank shrugged. Kid, the world don't work that way. Annie turned back to the dog, who had lifted his head slightly now, watching her with tired eyes. You don't believe that, do you? She whispered. The dog didn't answer, but he didn't look away either. For the next few weeks, every Saturday, Annie came back. She saved bits of food from breakfast, half a piece of toast, a strip of bacon wrapped carefully in a napkin, and offered them to the dog. At first, he was hesitant, sniffing the food but not taking it. But after a while, hunger won over caution, and he gently took the food from her hand. She talked to him too, sitting cross-legged in the dirt beside him. She told him about school, about how she had a loose tooth, about how she had seen a bluebird outside her window that morning. And slowly, the dog began to change. It was subtle at first. A slight shift in his posture. The way his ears twitched when he heard her voice. A flicker in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Then, one Saturday, as Annie approached, his tail wagged, just once, but enough. Margaret saw it and placed a gentle hand on her granddaughter's shoulder. He trusts you, she said quietly. Annie beamed. But her face soon grew serious. Grandma, I want to bring him home. Margaret sighed. Sweetheart, a dog is a big responsibility. And we don't know where he's been or what he's been through. But he deserves a family, Annie said, her voice unwavering. Margaret studied her granddaughter carefully, then looked at the dog, the way he watched Annie now, the way he no longer flinched at her touch. And she made up her mind. That afternoon, Margaret approached Frank Dawson. What's your price for the dog? She asked, her voice calm but firm. Frank looked at her with mild surprise, then snorted. $20. If you're fool enough to want him. Margaret pulled out her worn leather wallet and handed him the money. He took it without much care, already turning back to his stall. The moment the chain was unhooked, the dog hesitated. He stood still, looking from Annie to Margaret and back again, as if he wasn't sure this was real. Annie knelt beside him, her voice barely above a whisper. Come on, boy. You're coming home. And then, for the first time, he took a step forward. Then another. And another. By the time they reached the car, his tail was wagging. The ride home was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of the dog shifting in the back seat. Annie sat beside him, her small hand resting gently on his back. He didn't flinch at her touch, but he also didn't lean into it, not yet. Margaret kept glancing at them through the rearview mirror, her heart filled with cautious hope. Taking in a dog with an unknown past was a gamble, but something told her this was the right thing to do. As they pulled into their driveway, the dog hesitated before stepping out of the car. He took in his new surroundings, a white farmhouse with a wraparound porch, a garden filled with wildflowers, and a large oak tree that had stood for generations. Annie knelt beside him, speaking softly. This is home now, she said. You're safe here. The dog took one tentative step forward, then another. But the real work was just beginning. At first, he struggled. He wouldn't enter the house right away. The threshold seemed like an invisible wall, and no matter how much Annie coaxed him, he refused to cross it. Margaret had seen this before, dogs who had spent their lives outside, never knowing the warmth of a home. So they didn't push him. They left the door open and let him decide on his own time. That night, he lay curled up on the porch, his head resting on his paws. Annie sat beside him with a blanket draped over her shoulders, telling him stories as the crickets sang in the distance. I think I'll call you Shadow, she whispered. Because you follow me everywhere." His ears twitched at the name, but he made no other sign of recognition. Still, Annie smiled. Names took time, just like trust. The next few days were filled with small victories. He ate from a bowl instead of the ground. He let Annie brush his fur, though he tensed at first. He stepped inside the house, just for a moment, before retreating again. Margaret took him to the veterinarian, who confirmed what she already suspected: he had scars, old ones. He had been hurt before. "He'll need patience," the vet said. "And love." Margaret glanced at Annie, who was holding Shadow's paw in her small hands. "He has both." Weeks passed, and Shadow slowly transformed. His eyes weren't so dull anymore. His body filled out with good food and care. He started sleeping inside, though he preferred to stay near the door, as if still unsure of his place. And then came the night that changed everything. It was late when the sound of barking shattered the silence. Margaret jolted awake, her heart pounding. Shadow was at the front door, his fur bristling, his deep bark echoing through the house. Annie came rushing down the stairs, rubbing her sleepy eyes. "What's wrong?" Margaret peeked out the window and saw movement near the fence, a shadowy figure creeping through their yard. A low growl rumbled from Shadow's chest. He didn't hesitate this time. He stepped forward, placing himself between Annie and the door. Margaret turned on the porch light, and the intruder, just a local troublemaker, ran off into the night. But the real moment wasn't the danger. It was what happened after. Shadow turned to Annie, his eyes searching hers. Then, for the first time, he nudged his head against her hand. Tears welled in Annie's eyes. "You saved us," she whispered. Margaret watched as Shadow finally leaned into Annie's touch, not out of fear or habit, but out of something else. Trust. The forgotten dog, once unwanted and unloved, had finally found where he belonged. The next day, Margaret took Annie back to the farmer's market. The usual bustle filled the air, but Annie wasn't interested in the stalls this time. She led her grandmother straight to Frank Dawson's vegetable stand. The old man glanced up, eyebrows raising when he saw the girl. "Back already?" he grumbled. Annie held her chin high. "I just wanted to say, thank you." Frank snorted. "For what?" "For letting me have Shadow." She smiled, standing tall. "He's the best dog in the world." Frank blinked, clearly not expecting those words. He rubbed the back of his neck, looking away. "Yeah, well, suppose it's better he's with you than wasting space here." But Margaret saw something flicker in the old man's eyes, a touch of regret, maybe even something softer. As they walked away, she smiled. Some people took longer to change than others. But if a dog like Shadow could learn to trust again, maybe a man like Frank Dawson could too. The days grew shorter, and autumn settled over Briarwood, painting the trees in hues of gold and crimson. The cool breeze carried the scent of damp earth and firewood, and the mornings were filled with the soft rustling of leaves. It had been over a month since Shadow had come home with Annie, and though he still carried the weight of his past, the dog that once lay lifeless outside Frank Dawson's stall was beginning to change. At first, it was in the smallest of ways, the way he followed Annie from room to room, always keeping her within sight, or how he let out a soft sigh of contentment when he curled up at the foot of her bed at night. He no longer flinched at sudden noises, no longer tensed when Margaret reached out to pat his head. He was learning, slowly, carefully, that this was a place where he was safe. One afternoon, as Margaret peeled apples for a pie in the kitchen, she glanced out the window and saw Annie in the yard, her laughter carrying through the crisp air. She was running, her arms outstretched like the wings of a bird, and just behind her, for the first time since they had brought him home, Shadow was running too. Margaret's hands stilled, her heart catching in her throat. She watched a shadow, his legs stretching long and strong, bounded across the yard with a joy he had never known before. Annie spun around, clapping her hands. "Come on, Shadow. You can go faster than that." Shadow barked, a real, deep, joyful bark, and surged forward, his tail wagging wildly. Margaret smiled, wiping her hands on her apron. The chains that had once held him, fear, neglect, loneliness, were beginning to break. That night, as she tucked Annie into bed, Margaret sat beside her and smoothed the little girl's hair. "You're doing something very special for him, you know," she said softly. Annie yawned, resting her head on the pillow. "What do you mean?" Margaret glanced at the foot of the bed, where Shadow lay curled up, his eyes already drooping shut. "You're teaching him how to love again." Annie thought about that for a moment, then smiled. "He's teaching me too." Margaret kissed her forehead. "And what is he teaching you?" Annie snuggled deeper into her blankets, whispering into the quiet. "That love is patient." Not everything came easy for Shadow. He still had ghosts, shadows of his past that clung to him in moments of doubt. One of those ghosts showed itself the morning Margaret took him to the veterinarian. "It's just a checkup," Margaret assured him as she led him toward the clinic's entrance. But as soon as they stepped through the door, Shadow froze. His body went rigid, and his tail tucked tightly between his legs. His breathing grew fast, his eyes darting from the counter to the shelves of medical supplies. And then, panic. Before Margaret could react, Shadow bolted. He yanked the leash so hard that it slipped from her hands, and in an instant, he was outside, running. Margaret's heart pounded. "Shadow! Stop!" But he was lost in his fear, running as if he were being chased by ghosts only he could see. Annie, who had been waiting outside with a book in her lap, saw him tear down the street. Without thinking, she stood and called out, not with panic, but with love. "Shadow! Come home!" And then, he stopped. His paws skidded against the pavement. He turned, panting, confused, his body trembling. He looked at Annie, and something inside him shifted. Slowly, he took one step back toward her. Then another. Annie knelt, arms open. "It's okay," she whispered. "I'm here." Margaret, catching up, placed a hand on her chest, exhaling in relief as Shadow finally walked back into Annie's arms. That day, the vet confirmed what they already knew: Shadow had been through a hard life. There were old scars beneath his thickening coat, worn-down teeth from hunger and chewing through restraints. He had arthritis in his back legs, probably from sleeping on cold pavement for years. But the vet also gave them hope. "He's getting stronger," the vet said. "Whatever happened to him before, he's healing now." Annie held Shadow's paw in her hands, her voice filled with conviction. "He's already home." Winter came quickly to Briarwood that year. Snow blanketed the fields, and the farmhouse smelled of cinnamon and pine. On Christmas Eve, the town held its annual holiday festival in the square, and though Margaret had planned for Annie to go, the little girl refused to leave Shadow alone. "He's never had Christmas before," she explained. Margaret smiled. "Then let's give him one to remember." Together, they decorated a small tree in the living room, hanging simple handmade ornaments from its branches. Annie wrapped a bone in red ribbon and placed it under the tree. Shadow sniffed it curiously but seemed more interested in curling up beside Annie as she sipped hot cocoa. And then, just as the fire crackled low, he did something he had never done before. He lifted his head, looked at Annie, and, gently, carefully, placed his paw in her lap. Annie's breath caught. She placed her small hand over his paw, stroking it gently. "You're my best friend," she whispered. Margaret, watching from her rocking chair, felt tears in her eyes. For the first time, Shadow was not just surviving, he was living. And in that moment, in the glow of Christmas lights and the warmth of a home that was finally his, he knew he was loved. Winter in Briarwood had settled in thick and heavy. Snowdrifts lined the roads, and icicles hung like glass daggers from rooftops. Shadow had grown comfortable with his new life, spending his days curled at Annie's feet or following her through the fields, his once dull coat now thick and shining. But life has a way of testing the strongest bonds, and Shadow's would be tested in a way none of them saw coming. It happened on an ordinary morning. The sky was clear, the air crisp with the sharp bite of cold. Annie was in the backyard, bundled in her coat and mittens, playing near the old wooden fence that separated their yard from the neighbors. Shadow sat beside her, watching as she piled snow into a lopsided snowman. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, sipping her coffee, smiling at the sight of them together. If someone had told her a few months ago that the dog they found chained and hopeless at the market would now be guarding her granddaughter like a lifelong friend, she wouldn't have believed it. Then, a sound split the quiet morning, a deep, guttural growl. Margaret's mug slipped from her hands, shattering against the sink. She looked up just in time to see the neighbor's dog, a large, aggressive mastiff, push through a loose panel in the fence. It had always been a mean-tempered animal, kept in a pen too small for its size. Its energy turned into frustration. Now, it was loose, and it was charging toward Annie. Margaret barely had time to move before Shadow was already in motion. His body tensed, his ears pinned back. In a flash, he lunged, placing himself between Annie and the mastiff, standing his ground. The mastiff snarled, its massive frame barreling forward. But Shadow didn't back down. He let out a bark so deep and sharp it seemed to shake the air. Then, he lunged. Margaret threw open the door, running toward them. "Annie! Get back!" Annie, frozen in fear, stumbled backward just as Shadow and the mastiff collided. The world narrowed to snarls and snapping teeth. The mastiff, larger and younger, had the advantage in strength. But Shadow had something else, something deeper. He had something to protect. With a fierce growl, he sank his teeth into the mastiff's shoulder, twisting his body to knock it off balance. They tumbled into the snow, a flurry of motion, Shadow refusing to let the mastiff anywhere near Annie. Margaret reached Annie and pulled her into her arms. "It's okay, baby. I've got you." But Annie's wide, tear-filled eyes stayed locked on Shadow. "Grandma, he's not running away." Margaret understood immediately. Shadow, who had once cowered from a raised voice, who had spent his life in fear, wasn't running this time. He was standing his ground. The fight didn't last long. The mastiff, confused and outmatched in sheer determination, let out a sharp yelp and staggered backward, retreating through the broken fence. Shadow stood there, his breath heavy, his muscles still coiled as he watched the other dog disappear. Then, after a long moment, he turned back to Annie. His body was trembling, his legs unsteady, but his eyes searched for her first. Annie ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck. "You saved me," she whispered. Shadow, exhausted, let out a low sigh and pressed his forehead against her chest. Margaret knelt beside them, running her hands gently over his fur. There was a scratch above his eye, a small wound on his ear, but nothing serious. He had fought, and he had won. Not just against the mastiff. Against his own past. That evening, Margaret wrapped Shadow in a warm blanket beside the fireplace. Annie sat beside him, stroking his fur, whispering to him like he was the most important thing in the world. Margaret watched them, her heart swelling with something she couldn't quite put into words. She reached out, smoothing her hand over Shadow's head. "You're not the same dog we brought home," are you?" she said softly. Shadow lifted his head slightly and nudged her hand, not out of fear, not out of submission, but out of trust. Annie grinned. "He's not afraid anymore, Grandma." Margaret smiled. "No, he's not. Because Shadow wasn't just a rescued dog anymore. He was family." Winter slowly melted into spring, and the days in Briarwood grew longer. The snow that had once covered the fields was now replaced by fresh green grass, and the gentle warmth of the sun coaxed flowers to bloom along the old wooden fence. Shadow had changed in ways that Margaret never could have imagined. The dog that once lay forgotten outside a vegetable stall, too afraid to meet anyone's eyes, now ran freely through the fields with Annie, his tail high, his spirit unburdened. The scars of his past still lingered. Some wounds don't fade completely, but they no longer defined him. He had found his home. Every morning, Shadow waited by the door, wagging his tail, ready for the day's adventures. Annie would burst outside with a laugh, and together they would explore the rolling hills behind the farmhouse. At night, Shadow no longer curled up outside on the porch, hesitant to enter the warmth of the home. He slept soundly at the foot of Annie's bed, his breathing deep and steady, as if he had finally allowed himself to rest. And Margaret? She often found herself watching him, noticing the way he walked with confidence now, the way he leaned into Annie's touch rather than shying away. One afternoon, as she sat in her rocking chair on the porch, Shadow climbed up beside her, resting his head against her knee. She chuckled, stroking his fur. "Well, aren't you just full of surprises?" Shadow let out a soft sigh, content. Yes, he was full of surprises. One Saturday in early summer, Annie tugged on Margaret's hand. "Grandma, can we go back to the market?" Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You sure you're not looking for another stray?" Annie giggled. "No, I want to show them how happy Shadow is." So they went. The market bustled with the usual energy, vendors calling out their prices, children running between stalls, the smell of fresh bread drifting through the warm air. But Annie only had eyes for one stall. She marched up to Frank Dawson's vegetable stand, her chin held high. Frank glanced up, startled. "Back again?" Annie grinned. "I just wanted to show you something." She turned and whistled softly. From behind Margaret, Shadow stepped forward. Frank's eyebrows shot up. "Well, I'll be." The dog standing in front of him was not the same creature he had once chained to that post. Shadow's coat was thick and golden now, his eyes bright and alert. He stood tall beside Annie, his tail wagging gently as he looked up at her with unquestionable loyalty. Frank scratched his chin, shifting uncomfortably. "Looks like he cleaned up nice." Annie nodded proudly. "He's the best dog in the world." For the first time, Frank's gruff exterior cracked just slightly. He cleared his throat, looking away. "Well, guess you did right by him." Margaret saw it, the flicker of something in the old man's eyes. Maybe regret. Maybe even admiration. As they turned to leave, Frank called out, his voice softer than usual. "Take care of that mutt, you hear?" Annie beamed. "I will." And Shadow trotted beside her, his head high, his past left behind. That evening, Margaret sat with Annie on the porch, watching the fireflies dance in the tall grass. Shadow lay at their feet, his body completely at ease. Annie broke the silence. "Grandma, do you think Shadow remembers his old life?" Margaret thought for a moment, gazing at the peaceful dog beside them. "Maybe," she said softly. "But I think he knows this is where he belongs now." Annie smiled, resting her head against Margaret's shoulder. "I think so too." Margaret kissed the top of her head. "You know, sweetheart, love is a powerful thing. It doesn't just heal wounds, it helps us become who we were always meant to be. Shadow let out a soft, content sigh, and as Annie stroked his fur, she whispered, "I love you, Shadow." For the first time in his life, Shadow knew the feeling was mutual. And for him, that was all that mattered.